Good afternoon, Pat.
Good afternoon, Aaron.
Thanks for joining us all the way from Thunder Bay.
I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's been 10 years. Let's talk about what brought us here. You were appointed by the Canadian Minister of Finance to chair a task force to review the Canadian payment system, to look at competition or the lack thereof in the Canadian payments ecosystem, to look at how the players were working together, what the costs were for Canadians and Canadian businesses, and the potentially the challenges that companies may be having trying to create competition in the industry. How do you think that led to the formation of the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada and Identity North?
Well, so that's a very good question. So one of the other elements that we were asked to look at was how technology was going to change the payments industry in Canada. And so as we dug into the technology and its impact on payments, what we realized is that digital identification and authentication was a critical element of payments, that without the ability to identify the payor and the payee and authenticate that they were who they said they were, you could not have a secure and reliable payment system. And so that realization came very early on in our work. And we, because it was such an important issue, we very quickly brought in a number of experts on digital identification and digital identity and authentication. Experts from the UK and other jurisdictions to help us understand what would be the most effective way for Canada to move forward. And that, as we moved through the process, which we're going to talk about, led to the creation of a working group specifically dedicated to dealing with the digital ID and authentication issue, which, after the task force disbanded, moved to create the group, of roughly 40 people, chose to continue to collaborate and, jointly between governments and the private sector, created the Digital Identification and Authentication Council of Canada. And you were very involved in both the founding of DIAC and the founding of Identity North by carrying on that work that the working group had just barely begun.
I had no idea when we first got started that I was signing up for a 10-year project. I have to admit that. The interesting thing for me was that your approach right from the beginning was not to follow the kind of usual way that task forces might work of writing up a number of recommendations or insights and putting them in a big fat binder, and then people put them on a shelf and they gather dust for a long time and maybe get pulled out 10, 20 years down the road. And when someone says, see, Dr. Meredith and the rest of the task force, they told us that this was going to happen kind of 10, 20 years ago. So you weren't going to be satisfied with just doing a traditional task force.
Well, and that really was the fault is probably the wrong word. The credit goes to the task force itself. So I was just reviewing my notes yesterday, and in our first meeting in June of 2010, when the task force first got together, the task force set a goal to, by 2020, ensure that Canada had a digital payment system that was open to all users, that was low cost, high, information rich, low cost, digital, and accessible by non-financial institutions. And I was surprised at how specific the task force was that early in the process. And so as chair of the task force, I really had to stop and think about the process we were going to follow, because the traditional process that you outlined was not going to achieve that objective. And so, it really required us to think very differently about how we went about our task.
It really seems that you were defining, that success really differently than other task forces, that you actually wanted to catalyze change.
Well, and yes, in a word, that was exactly what we wanted to achieve, was to be able to start a process that we recognized even early on was going to take a decade. That, as one of the participants said, we always overestimate what we can do in 2 years and underestimate what we can accomplish in 10. Well, I don't think the task force was, unrealistic in its expectations. Canada will have by it already has a real-time digital payment system that, carries virtually an unlimited amount of information. And with the most recent budget legislation, a system that will be open not only to financial institutions, but to technology companies and other fintechs that are looking to get into the payments business. So we realized that it was a long process. Probably the biggest reason that I realized we needed a very different process is that I had just finished writing my PhD thesis, which was on the title of the thesis is Why the Frog Does Not Jump Out of the Boiling Water. And what I had been studying was why companies did not change when it became obvious that the environment they were operating in was changing. And so as a result of that work and that research, I had a pretty clear idea what the obstacles to overcome were. And, as George Bernard Shaw said, you can't change anything until you change your mind. And what I realized from my research is that the real key to change was to bring together a group of people who were, impacted by that change and who had a stake in the game, and to have them engage in a dialogue about the future and about the ways in which the changes in technology, the changes in society's expectations were reshaping or were likely to reshape the payments business. And it was really through that dialogue and through that focus on the future, what might the future look like, that the community of interest, the payments community, was formed, and informing or creating a community to talk about the future of the industry and to envision, alternative futures and to come up with the one that was the most desirable to the community. What we were able to build is a coalition of the willing, a large enough group of participants and a broad enough group of participants that we were able to, after the task force, finished up its report, the work was able to carry on through organizations like DIAC and, Payments Canada, and even within the Bank of Canada and the Department of Finance.
It really struck me that, we saw a lot of people being invited, and probably more people being invited and consulted but brought together than had ever been done for a task force before. And it seemed actually that as you invited, a critical mass, that more people started trying to be part of it as well.
Well, and, in 2010, when we first began, we made the decision, the task force made the decision to put all of our work online. So the whole consultation process, the direct research that we did on the Canadian payment system. So we published a Canadian payments landscape that people could comment on, make revisions to online. We put the consultation process, all of the responses to the task force and the issues that were raised by consumers, businesses, incumbents, new entrants into the task force were posted online. And it was early days for social media. So, we would certainly be able to do much more today than we were then. But we were able to bring through even that initial attempt, hundreds of people into the dialogue. Directly, the task force itself was 7 people, including myself. But we, created a roundtable of 40 people, which gave us much more direct representation from the banking industry, the technology industry, consumer groups, small business, retailers. The payment system impacts everyone, and so the roundtable really enabled us to give all of the key stakeholders a voice in determining the future of the Canadian payment system. And I think that was a critical element. And then as we, as the roundtable developed the possible scenarios for the future of the payment system, we then, invited another 100 people to come and comment on those, potential futures. And as we moved from envisioning a future to co-creating the most desirable future, we moved into working groups, which brought another, couple hundred people into not only the dialogue, but actually rolling up their sleeves and doing the legwork that was necessary in order to begin to map out the actual, changes, legislative, system, technology, governance changes that were necessary in order to create the payment system of the, that would serve Canada in the future.
And you really created a process that was, impossible to ignore, and a buzz within the industry. And I would argue to say, no one wanted to be left out of your meetings.
Right.
Do you think Minister Flaherty knew exactly what he was getting into when he asked you to chair this task force?
I doubt it. I think that what he knew, because the mandate was extremely well written. So the person who wrote the mandate for the task force clearly understood these sort of seismic changes that were happening in the industry. And, the rumor that I heard was that Minister Flaherty had been in a taxi cab with another finance minister in a third world country in Southeast Asia, or a country in Southeast Asia. And he and the other finance minister had sort of paid for the cab ride without having to pull out his credit card or cash. And that really sort of caused the minister to take notice and to realize that Canada's payment system was potentially falling behind. And so I think he was well aware of the need to, to really look at where our payment system was going. I think that he had heard, numerous complaints from users, particularly credit card users, company retailers using credit cards, that there were some challenges in the payment system. And so he, the combination of, those observations, those complaints really led to the creation of a very open-ended mandate and, the need to address the challenges in the payment system. Do I think he understood just how far we would go in terms of including, all of the stakeholders in the dialogue and in the co-creation of the future payment system? No, because that was a first.
Yeah. But you arguably were the right person at the right time. You had spent a lot of time in the trenches analyzing banking. You understood the industry in ways that a lot of others really didn't. And you had made some very prescient calls over the years. How had that worked out?
So I really started my career in banking, analyzing banks. First, from a regulatory standpoint for capital adequacy and liquidity, and then as an investment analyst. So I, had taken a very analytical approach to the industry. As Chief Strategy Officer of CIBC, I had analyzed all of the bank's businesses, I think 75 different businesses, in detail, but the payments industry in particular. So the bank, payments was not an industry prior to the payments task force. It was a part of retail banking, and it was so intertwined with what we called the retail banking business model that there was not a recognition of payments in Canada. There was a recognition in the US, but that payments was a separate business, and that technology, fintech players would be able to deliver payment services without necessarily being in the banking business. And seeing that, the need to separate payments from banking, traditional taking deposits and making loans, was the first step. Now, in fairness, that was a issue that we tackled 3 separate times at CIBC before we understood just how significant the payments business was, how impactful it was, because, when you asked a customer who their bank was, they automatically replied with the institution that, had their transaction account. And yet, they might have their mortgage someplace else, their retirement savings in a third place. And yet the institution they identified with was the one that transacted their payments. And so it was critical not only to the economy, because it obviously backs, every economic transaction, or almost all economic transactions have a payment component to them, but it also was the cornerstone to relationship banking.
Right.
So it was, having spent, roughly I'm trying to think, 15, 20 years analyzing banks, in the trenches, tearing the numbers apart, really gave me the sort of insight into what was an emerging industry at that point in time. The other thing that really contributed is I began studying the internet and spent a significant amount of time in Silicon Valley, particularly with HP, who CIBC had a partnership with at that time. Really understanding what the internet was all about, how it was going to impact banking. I remember when Steve Jobs said, we'll always need banks, we'll always need banking, we won't always need banks. I sort of took notice and said, help me understand this. And, my curiosity around that statement and around the developing technology really gave me the sort of background I need to begin to understand how the payments business could evolve.
I have to say, when we were working together kind of 10 years ago, I didn't understand at the time just how much you had done over your career to get you to be at that right place when the industry and arguably our digital economy really needed to have someone with your background, expertise, and ability to kind of help catalyze change. I'm conscious that since we wrapped up the task force almost a decade ago now, you spent a lot of your time both teaching and writing. Can you tell us a little bit about what's driven you there? And you haven't just written one or two books. You've been quite busy.
So after we wrapped up the task force, I had engaged two people, Stephen Roselle and Jed Davis, to work with the task force to create the process that I referred to earlier. Steve Roselle had spent 30 or 40 years managing strategic dialogue, working in leadership and governance around, particularly with both the US and the Canadian government. So had dealt with huge systemic issues, things like healthcare and, finding a common agenda for the Republicans and the Democrats in the US. So he had a lot of experience in bringing together folks who wouldn't normally work effectively together in order to create change. And the other person who worked with us on that process was Jed Davis, who had been the vice president of strategic planning for Royal Dutch Shell for 25 years, and one of the most experienced individuals in conducting and scenario planning and developing scenarios. He had taken, after he left Royal Dutch Shell, he performed the same function for the World Economic Forum. And so, the three of us, after we completed the work on the payments task force, said, we have learned a lot about transformative change, how difficult it is, but also some of the key levers. And we recognized that the process we had followed more through intuition than through anything else was a process that could be codified. And so the first book we wrote was Catalytic Governance, which was a deep case study on the payments task force, really to pull out the key elements of a 5-step process for catalyzing change. And so that was a direct result of the payments task force. The other two books that I've written in the last 8 years, although it's actually 5 years that I've written the other two, are on governance. So, strategy and governance are extremely important at this juncture in history, given all of the changes being driven by, new general purpose technologies like, computing, wireless phones, cloud computing, AI, robots, the list goes on. Businesses and industries are being forced to change. And when you combine that with the changes in society that we're seeing, that go almost hand in hand with those changes in technology, the drive towards, being including more stakeholders, being more environmentally aware and conscious. It really, those things come together in a way that necessitates significant changes, which can only happen through collaborative dialogue and working together. So the last two books, so the first one was Stumbling Giants, really talks about how those changes will impact the banking industry and the need for the banking industry to really adapt to the information age. And the third book, Better Boardrooms, talks about the changes that are necessary in the boardroom in order to be effective in a world where all stakeholders expect to have a voice in governing organizations.
Pat, you're not done, and I know, but I'm not going to give you have you give us give away the secrets of what's coming. But I have to say that based on what we've talked about today alone, not to mention what you have still to come, this award that I have here in my hands is very, very much deserved. So, Dr. Patricia Meredith, the leadership that you have shown throughout your career, starting before there were even bank machines, let alone online banking or digital payments, helping Canada's financial services industry to innovate and adapt to meet the opportunities of the new digital age has been foundational. Your command of the task force for the payment system review, driving some of the most transformative changes to the Canadian payments ecosystem, have also proven very impactful despite the expectations of many observers. Ultimately, responsible for the launch of the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada and Identity North itself. Given your exceptional efforts creating a robust digital economy for Canadians, Canadian businesses, and our community, your work on behalf of all Canadians to transform the payment system as Canada's chair of the Task Force of the Payment System Review, catalyzing the action and the support of government, community, and industry leaders, the Identity North community is pleased to recognize you as a founder of Canada's digital economy.
Thank you, Aaron. This award means a lot to me. I realized as I was reflecting on the award after you mentioned that that I had been that I was going to receive it, that being a pioneer was an important part of my entire career. As a woman in business, I, was one of the first, in fact, I was the first female accountant in Thunder Bay. I was, one of the first women to join the C-suite of a bank. And and that the Payments Task Force was unique in many ways, as we've talked about, and that it was clearly an important part of Canada's digital future. And so I am very honored to be recognized both as a pioneer and as a contributor to our digital future. And yes, I'm going to continue to contribute to creating that digital future.
Well, I can't think of a better place to be doing it this summer than up in Thunder Bay. So all of our best wishes to you up there. We look forward to getting together and celebrating with a nice glass of something and a nice dinner when this pandemic is all over. In the meantime, please accept our great thanks and gratitude on behalf of the community, and we look forward to keeping in touch and welcome you back to Identity North on a regular basis.
Well, thank you.